Okay, where were we? Okay, again, by 1860, Abraham had created a large manufacturing center at West Overton. Again, I mentioned he acquired the Broadford distillery a year previously in 1859. And as you can see, Abraham had created an early pre-Gilded Age model of vertical integration. Um, Management style, of course, that his grandson, Henry Clay Frick, and his grandson's business partner, Andrew Carnegie, would make famous later in the century. Abraham controlled every step of the production process, from the rye grain that he used to make his whiskey, right down to the barrels that he used to age and transport the whiskey. He also built worker housing on site at West Overton, as well as a general store. And in many ways, West Overton in this period was comparable to Lowell, Massachusetts, and also in some ways comparable to Pullman, Illinois, a generation later. But fortunately, there was no equivalent to the Pullman strike, as I'll mention a little bit later. One worker who lived on site at West Overton was a young miller named John W. Frick. Again, I'll also talk more about him later, but Abraham's flagship brand of whiskey in this period is most often remembered as Old Farm Pure Rye. Old referring to the fact that the whiskey had been barrel aged, pure rye referring to the fact that the whiskey was a high rye. That is, the mash bill, or the grains that go in to make the whiskey, consisted almost exclusively of rye grain. And remember, again, this was before modern trademark laws and branding practices. Bottling, labeling, branding, and marketing whiskey was typically handled by retailers in this period. So you'll see Abraham's whiskey referred to by various names. But his whiskey came to be respected all across the region and across the country for his quality. Newspapers at the time would frequently advertise it as Overholt's famous or top quality rye. And Abraham's whiskey, along with other brands of Monongahela rye whiskey, as whiskey from Western Pennsylvania came to be known, came to be the favored domestically produced spirit of the established East Coast society. Again, Monongahela rye whiskey was no longer stigmatized by the early to mid 19th century as it had been in the 1790s by individuals like Alexander Hamilton. Though I think it's important to point out that even Hamilton's fellow founders, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, were not averse to producing whiskey themselves, or in Madison's case, consuming it themselves. Monongahela rye whiskey became the basis for a lot of famous American cocktails that emerged by the mid-19th century. Manhattans, old fashions. Long before bourbon and Canadian whiskeys were used to make these cocktails, people were using Monongahela rye whiskey. Now, Kentucky bourbon, on the other hand, in the mid-19th century, was a beverage that was looked down upon by many. As you might know, bourbon is a whiskey that contains a mash bill that's made from at least 51% corn. Corn was a grain that was eschewed by most Western Pennsylvania distillers in the 19th century. As I said, most Western Pennsylvania ryes were high ryes, meaning that their mash bills consisted almost exclusively of rye grain, with little to no corn or wheat. This gave Monongahela ryes a distinct flavor profile and distinguished them from Kentucky bourbons and also Canadian rye whiskeys in this period, which were made typically from a blend of grains. Now, this isn't to say that Abraham and other Western Pennsylvania distillers didn't use corn, didn't grow corn and use it to make whiskey, just that they typically didn't use it in the premier Monongahela ryes. And there were also lots of unscrupulous bourbon distillers and retailers in this period who did things like add tobacco juice to unaged whiskey to make it look like it had been barrel aged, or they would cut their bourbon with unaged grain alcohol to up the alcohol content. And this isn't to suggest that there weren't reputable bourbon producers in the 19th century. I'll touch on that in part two of my presentation, which I'll hopefully be able to give at a later date. I'll discuss the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897, which was passed to authenticate the quality of American whiskey. And despite the fame and the success that Abraham garnered from his distillery, it wasn't the most lucrative enterprise at West Overton, again, in contrast to how we might remember him today. His flour mill was actually the enterprise that generated the most revenue at West Overton. In 1850, his distillery had a gross income of $17,990, while his flour mill had a gross income of exactly $32,000. It wasn't until 1870, the last year of Abraham's life, that his flour mill outstripped the whiskey distillery in terms of gross income. That year, the distillery had a gross income of $40,512, whereas the flour mill had a gross income of exactly $25,000. It's also interesting to note that in the 1850s and 1860s, Abraham did not identify himself as a distiller. As late as 1857, he was still listed as a farmer on the tax rolls in Westmoreland County. Again, this despite the revenue generated by his enterprises at West Overton. After 1857, he was listed as old or retired on the tax rolls, of course, meaning that he was no longer engaged in day-to-day work. He was in his 70s by this point. The 1860 US Census, more succinctly, I think, simply identifies him as a manufacturer. Now, the workers at West Overton were a largely homogenous group, most of them white native-born males, most of them native-born Pennsylvanians, though there were some immigrants, mainly Germans, but also some Irish and British immigrants. The work at West Overton tended to be seasonal, based around the harvest. During the harvest, lots of workers would be hired by the day, people like field hands or helpers at the distillery. So positions at the distillery weren't necessarily permanent or full-time. Again, some workers owned their own farms in the area and would go back to farming once their work at the distillery was completed. Some workers would later go on to acquire their own farms after working for Abraham for a period. Of course, if you drive around the West Overton area nowadays, or if you're from the area, you might recognize a lot of roads and communities that are named after men who worked at the distillery in this period. And because work at the distillery tended to be seasonal, and because the distilling process itself did not experience the same level of technological advances and subsequent de-skilling as other major industries like the steel industry in the 19th century, the workers at West Overton and later on at Broadford generally did not experience the same upheavals as workers in other industries in the 19th century. For example, there's no evidence that there was ever a central clock or whistle that controlled work at West Overton. Workers who owned watches and clocks did so for their own convenience. I think it's interesting to point out that Abraham Overholt owned a gold watch and chain valued at $175 in the 1860s. He was assessed a tax by the Westmoreland County tax assessor, along with other items that he considered excess furniture. For what it's worth, Abraham also owned a $350 piano. And so the Overholts were very much prosperous by the standards of their community. Abraham, his sons, and his nephews formed a managerial class in the West Overton area. Again, they basically ran the company and the communities around it. As I said, Abraham built houses on site for his workers at West Overton, as well as a general store that was managed by his son, Christian S. Overholt. And as I said, the workers at West Overton typically had a short tenure. John Frick, however, is an exception, and not just because he married Abraham's daughter, Elizabeth. John worked off and on for Abraham for multiple decades. He started working at West Overton in 1845 as a miller. He married Elizabeth Overholt in 1847 and then worked off and on at the distillery for the next 20 years. Family lore, or more precisely, the recollections of Henry Clay Frick's nephew, Carl Overholt Frick, hold that John and his family were living in the small spring house behind Abraham Overholt's house when Henry Clay Frick was born in 1849. In 1852, John and his family moved to Pleasant Unity, 3 miles north of West Overton, and John and his family moved frequently in this period, every 2 to 4 years generally, between 1850 and 1866. By 1862, John and his family were living in Workers' House B at West Overton, and John was making $30 a month as a miller at West Overton. He was also paying $12.50 in rent, every 3 months in rent at West Overton. And in the 1860s, Henry Clay Frick began working at the distilleries at Broadford and West Overton. Now, you might have heard about him working as a clerk and a bookkeeper for his uncles and grandfather. It's said that by 1869, when he was in his late teens, early 20s, that Frick was earning $1,000 a year as chief bookkeeper at his grandfather's Broadford distillery. By his early teens, Frick worked at the general store in West Overton that was owned by his uncle Christian S. Overholt. He also worked at a general store in Mount Pleasant that was owned by his uncle Abraham's son Martin Overholt. Again, both of these men were managers and bookkeepers at the West Overton and Broadford distilleries. By working for his uncles and his grandfather, Frick would have obviously learned the basics of bookkeeping and running a business. He would have also seen coal used for industrial applications. Abraham would have used coal to fire his stills at West Overton, to power his grist mill, and possibly also to char the insides of his whiskey barrels, though they may have used wood fires as many cooperages, such as the cooperage that we buy our barrels from at Wiggle, do today. Frick would have also observed the benefits of vertical integration and how his grandfather controlled every aspect of the production process for his particular industry. Frick also gained a considerable amount of economic and social capital by working for his grandfather at the distillery, and of course had Abraham's reputation and the reputation of his family's business enterprises to lean on when he approached Judge Thomas Mellon in 1871 for his first business loan. Now, to conclude part one of this lecture, Abraham and his son Henry S. Overholt both died in 1870. Abraham left an estate worth around $400,000. Remember, this was the dawn of the Gilded Age in 1870, so $400,000 was quite a lot of money. His son Henry S. Overholt left an estate valued at $137,000. Now, Abraham left most of his fortune to his widow and surviving children. Henry's son, Christian S.R. Overholt, again, not to be confused with Christian S. Overholt. You can see the Overholts weren't the most creative family when it came to naming their children. And at any one time, there seems to be 5 people named Henry, 5 people named Abraham, all living and working in the same area. But anyway, Christian S.R. Overholt became the manager of the West Overton distillery upon his father's death. And Abraham's grandson, Abraham Overholt Tinsman, whom of course was one of the founding partners in Frick's Coke Company, took over the Broadford distillery. Now, Frick did not receive an inheritance nor a share of his grandfather's distilleries from his grandfather's will, but he of course had the money that he earned as a bookkeeper and the reputation of his grandfather and his family's business enterprises to bank on as he started his own business career in 1871. Now, by the 1880s, Frick would take over both of his grandfather's distilleries, and under Frick's ownership, Old Overholt, as it was called by the 1890s, became one of the most respected labels of Monongahela rye whiskey. Hopefully, I'll be able to talk more about that in part 2 of my presentation, when I focus on the history of the Overholt brand from 1871 to 1987. Now, I do have a few pictures I'd like to share with you. I apologize for the image quality here, but you'll see this is a lithograph of West Overton from an atlas of Westmoreland County in 1867, reprinted in 1876. If you're interested to have a closer look, I suggest Google searching it. You can see some of these details more clearly. But if you look here in the upper left corner, you'll see these coke ovens that the Overholts had begun building at West Overton. And it showed, or it foreshadowed, how the Overholts, like the rest of the region, were beginning to transition from agrarian-based industries like distilling into heavy industries like coke production and steel production. And then here, of course, is the grist house and distillery at West Overton that Abraham built in 1859. The signs on the front of the building are from a later period, from the 1890s. That's what West Overton was called by the 1890s. And of course, the Old Farm Pure Rye label is there on the building. And then here's Abraham Overholt's house. He began construction on the house in 1838. And behind the house, of course, is the spring house where Henry Clay Frick was supposed to have been born on December the 19th, 1849. And then here's a view of the Broadford distilling complex as it looked in the 1870s, 1880s. Here's a close-up of a barrel house at Broadford, and on the hillside in the background, if you can make it out, you'll see some coke ovens from the H.C. Frick Coke Company. And then thank you, Tom, for providing us this picture. This is one of the buildings that's still standing at Broadford. This is an old granary and grain elevator. I believe this building, or at least most of the building, was constructed in the early 20th century. And the Broadford site was heavily redone over the years, sometimes out of necessity, as there were several major fires that had devastating effects on West Overton and Broadford that I'll talk more about in part 2 of my presentation. And then here's one of the earliest newspaper listings I was able to find for Abraham's whiskey. These are from the Baltimore Sun in 1843. You'll see up here is a listing for his flour, down here a listing for his whiskey. Here's one from the Charleston Daily Courier in Charleston, South Carolina in 1849. You'll note Overholt is misspelled as Overholtz. Again, branding was handled by retailers and not producers at this time. And then here's a portrait of Abraham Overholt in 1865. A similar portrait would, of course, grace the bottles of Old Overholt by the 1890s. Here's Abraham's sons, Henry S. Overholt and Jacob S. Overholt. Again, they were managing partners at the West Overton and Broadford distilleries. And then here's Abraham Overholt Tinsman. Again, he became one of the partners and the manager of the Broadford distillery by the 1860s. And he, of course, was one of the founding partners in Henry Clay Frick's Coke Company. Really, he was the one that sort of started what became H.C. Frick Coke before Frick came on board in the 1870s. And here's John and Elizabeth Frick later on in their lives around 1880. Again, John Frick, Henry Clay Frick's father, his mother, Elizabeth Overholt Frick, Abraham Overholt's daughter. And then last but not least, here's a young Henry Clay Frick circa 1870 as he looked around the time that he began working as a bookkeeper at his grandfather's distillery and around the time he started his Coke company.